As soon as she asked me if I could feel it, too, I turned to look over my shoulder, and I swear, even though it was almost pitch black in my room, that corner was somehow darker. Darker than black, if that makes any sense. I turned on the light, and my friend stood up quickly. Her face was pale white, and she was sweating as well. As soon as the light turned on, the feeling went away. I told her that I felt it too, but I didn't want to freak her out anymore. She was obviously already terrified, and telling her that this thing has pretty much tormented me since I was 9 years old seemed like it would only make it worse. So we watched a movie and then fell asleep with the lights on. We never talked about it again, and she never spent the night at my house again. I can't say that I blame her, but that was a very important turning point for me, because for the first time, I had turned to face the darkness. I was brave enough, for the first time, to face my fears. And while it didn't make the presence go away, it did start to shape me into the person I would become and who I am now. A year or so later, I would start to get into creepypasta, and would start reading it all day, every day. I had decided that if I was going to live in constant fear, that I would face the things that scared me. I had this theory that if I went looking for the things that made me afraid and faced them, that it would take away their power. And for the most part, I was right. It's also why when I eventually came up with the character for this channel, I chose to make her a monster hunter. Because in a way, hunting down and facing my proverbial monsters was the only way that I knew how to defeat them. This doesn't mean that I had defeated the dark presence that plagued me. I simply had learned how to control the feelings of terror. I learned how to just accept the weight on my chest and the constant sick feeling. At a few points during the span of years that I was tormented, my parents had to take me to the doctor because I'd be losing hair or my body would just stop digesting food, and the doctor would always say it was stress. I think my parents thought it was because of the bullying and not having kids to spend time with, which I'm sure made the problem worse, but wasn't really a source of stress. The loneliness and depression I would suffer from the social aspects of my younger years would definitely leave lasting scars, and were my nightmare during daylight hours. But at night, it was the presence. Further into my teenage years, I had learned to be alone and learned to accept being the weird kid. In both my social life and in dealing with this darkness, I had learned ways to survive. It wasn't a good existence, but I was existing. I started to surround myself with writing and art. I would lose myself for hours in books, music, and creepypasta. It didn't take the sting of the bullying or the crushing loneliness that I would feel away, so I still had lots of negative energy surrounding me. Unfortunately, that means that the presence would also remain as well. Since I couldn't just make myself less lonely or less hurt, I didn't really have any ammo against something that fed off of those emotions. Even if I faced the presence and made it clear that I wasn't afraid, it would still be there. Eventually, I just learned to live with it. Something important to note is that the presence seemed to feed off of whatever I was scared of at the time. For example, when I was young and it first started happening, I was terrified of the monster from Jeepers Creepers. I would always feel like I'd see it in the trees, or the darkness when we'd be driving at night. And when I would feel that presence in my room, my brain associated it with that monster, and that monster would be what would seep into my mind during the day when I'd feel that dread. Fast forward to when I was 15. At the time, the thing that I currently feared was Slenderman. This was way back when Slenderman was still terrifying and was a relatively new concept to the scene of creepypasta or scary internet forums. The stories themselves didn't scare me, but that's what I started to associate with the dread of the presence in my room. I'd start to have panic attacks going outside because I'd be afraid that I'd catch a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye in the trees, or that I'd walk out into the living room and I'd see him standing outside my big glass front door looking in. I guess the presence latched onto that because it knew that whatever scared me the most would resonate the most terror. So when I was 15, my grandfather who lived next door passed away. He'll end up getting his own video with an explanation of his relevance to the end of the story, but for now, the most important thing for you to understand is that my grandfather was the most important person in the world to me. Even at my lowest, at my darkest, and at my loneliest, he was always there. He could see that every day I woke up and it was a struggle to keep living. And I knew that he would do whatever he could to help me. He wasn't a very emotional person, but he was the only person that I ever felt like was trying to help me keep fighting. So when he passed away, it was without question the most devastating thing that has ever happened to me. The weeks, the months, and even years after would be much harder than I'd already experienced. But most notably, the week after he passed away. I don't remember exactly how many days after his funeral, but somewhere within a week, when I was in the absolute depths of despair, the presence made its move. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, covered in a cold sweat. I was staring up at my ceiling, but I remember noticing how much light was coming in through the windows from the moon. The light was so bright that I could see clearly everything in the room. There was no place for shadows there. But even staring up at the ceiling, I could feel that gut-wrenching, sick feeling and the feeling of the weight crushing on my chest. I knew that it was in the room with me. That's when I turned to my left to look over to the corner. And instead of the darkness, what I saw was the tall, thin, faceless, suit-wearing figure standing over my bed, clearly illuminated by the moonlight from the window next to it. I can't even begin to explain the feeling of fear that I felt. I just laid there frozen, staring at it, when it leaned down, putting its face, or lack thereof, within a few inches of mine. I didn't know what else to do, so I just pulled the blanket over my head like a little kid and laid there shaking with fear. I don't know how much time passed, but I either blacked out or fell back asleep for a few minutes. When I woke back up, I was still under the blanket. But something felt different. Almost without question, I pulled the blanket off of my head and looked around the room. I even sat up to investigate. The moon was still shining brightly into my bedroom, but the feeling was completely different. I can't really put into words what I felt. The feeling of absolute peace. Just light, quiet, joyful peace. Now, I've never done hard drugs, but if this is the feeling that it feels like when you get high, then I totally understand why people do hard drugs. A masked man with a chainsaw could have come into my room and it wouldn't have bothered me in the slightest. I felt completely at peace. The weight was gone off of my chest, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally free. The presence was gone and it never came back. Like I said before, I'll explain in another story how the ending is tied to my grandfather and his death, but I strongly believe that he protected me that night, and that he's the reason that it's gone. He deserves his own story, and this one is already pretty long as it is. But to summarize, I've never really thought that the creature that I encountered that night was the real Slenderman. I believe that the devastation and negative feelings from my grandfather passing away gave the dark presence in my room the energy that it needed to finally manifest itself in a physical form as the thing that it knew I would be the most scared of, which at the time was Slenderman. As for what the presence is or was, I still don't know. All I know is that it doesn't control me anymore, and that I truly know what it means to face your fears.